Hey guys, it's Timothy here. We are looking at part 3 of this 5-part series of the Draft Archetypes in Modern Masters 2017. We've already looked at the Bant Shard, we looked at Grixis and their respective archetypes. Today we're going to look at Naya, which is green, white, and red for those who don't know, and specifically the green-white combination, the Populate mechanic from Return to Ravnica. For those of you who don't know, Populate was an ability that allowed you to basically copy a token in addition to some other effects, meaning the bigger your tokens are, the better. Populate does scale in power depending on how strong your tokens are. So we're actually going to see a lot of overlap between this and Jund. Jund is also centered on tokens, but is more of a go wide strategy. Here with Naya, we're looking at more of a go big strategy with your tokens rather than go wide. So you'll see what I mean when you look at the two archetypes side by side, but there is going to be a little bit of overlap since both of them care about having tokens. With that being said, let's look at what we have from the Naya shard specifically. The rare in the set is Fiery Justice, which is really weird. Not to say Fiery Justice is a bad card. It's actually quite good and can pick off a good number of creatures, possibly 2 or 3 for just 3 mana, which is quite a deal. But it just doesn't fit into any particular theme that Naya is trying to do, especially with me already having stated that this is the token strategy. You can see that Fiery Justice is just a Naya card, not really a set piece at all. Woolly Thoktar, the king of all Thoktars, is here as a 3-mana 5/4 in Naya colors. If you can pull this off on turn 3, you should be able to at least eat a couple creatures, if not force a double or triple block really early in the game. Woolly Thoktar's real power is just being a super hyper efficient card, and you can see that just looking at the card itself. Woolly Thoktar is the type of card that you pick up and pushes you into Naya, as is the case with all the other uncommons, or at least the 3-color uncommons here. So take your Woolly Thoktars, take it as a sign that Naya is open, and beat down. It also just speaks towards wanting to go bigger rather than go wider, and Woolly Thoktar does a fantastic job of going big. The land here is Jungle Shrine. As with all the cases, there's not much to say about it, but I wanted to go ahead and point it out that their best mana fixer if you end up in this shard or in this archetype is, in fact, Jungle Shrine. Jungle Shrine, not Jumble Shrine. What to prioritize? Well, tokens, right? You're playing Populate, so you want to be able to populate those tokens. With that being said, you want cards that make large tokens so that your populate effects are more potent. If all you're doing is making 1/1 spirits and goblins and using your populate effects to make an additional goblin, your cards go way down in value. Naya wants you to go big. I'm going to keep saying that. Big tokens leads to big blowouts. Cards like Baloth Cage Trap, which makes a 4/4, Penumbra Spider, which leaves behind a very annoying 2/3 spider with reach, Giant Baden, which can make a 4/4, Urbis Protector, which makes a 4/4 flyer, Call of the Conclave, Censor Splicer, or all the Splicers in general, and Slime Molding in particular. All of these cards make reasonably good tokens rather than just 1/1s, and they're very good bait to copy. Giant Baden in particular is interesting because you exile the token on your end step, but with the populated mechanic, you can actually get a couple giants to stick around. Urbis Protector is probably a little bit overcosted, but if you can set up a turn where you can play this and also populate within the same turn, or be sure that you can populate at least once or twice during the following turn, the card really justifies a spot in the deck. All of the Splicers are here too, even though you probably don't want the blue Splicer in this particular build since it's more geared towards Bant colors, but if you have an easy blue splash, then sure, why not include the blue Splicers. But keep in mind, most of the Splicers are white, and there's one green one as well, so all of those fit pretty nicely, making 3/3 golems and setting you up for Populate. Not to mention that the Splicers go hand in hand with Populate since those golems work really nicely with the creatures that create them. Call of the Conclave is just super efficient, and Slime Molding gets a special shout out here since it actually lets you scale the power level of your Populate cards. The bigger your Slime Molding token, the better your Populate cards become. The other thing you want to prioritize, well, you wouldn't be a Populate deck unless you had abilities that actually had the Populate mechanic. Rootborn Defenses is really nice, and you'll see why when I get to the slide about how to beat this archetype. Rootborn Defenses just saves your team from potential board wipes, or just lets you swing in for tons of damage without any fear that your creatures are going to die. It's not a super efficient spell, but if you can get that Populate to make a reasonable sized creature while also protecting your team for the turn, it's quite good. Wayfarer and Temple used to be a rare, which says something about the power level of the card. If you're able to make a generally large field and get this creature into the red zone and deal damage, you should be able to swing the game out of control in pretty much no time. The more evasive you can make Wayfarer and Temple, the better. Since it doesn't have any built-in evasion, you're going to have to want to focus on making sure your team is large. But again, Naya is not really set up to be going wide, even though there are a lot of tokens that can help you out with that. Cards like Lingering Souls, anything that makes multiple tokens out of the same card is going to help your Wayfarer and Temple out here. Wake the Reflections, about as simple as a card gets. The actual Populate card, this might as well have just been called Populate instead of Wake the Reflections, but a 1-mana spell that lets you populate. If you can use this in conjunction with anything that's a 3/3 or larger, you're getting a real good deal. A 1-mana 3/3 or 4/4, potentially even 5/5 or higher with something like Slime Molden, and you're really talking about it. This is the type of card that nobody else wants either. If you're not a token deck, there's no reason for you to have Populate cards in your deck since they're a little inefficient otherwise. But Wake the Reflections is the hallmark, the poster child of cards that nobody else wants. So if you are the Populate deck and you have an embargo on that at your table, you should be able to pick this card up pretty late. Same goes for Eyes in the Skies. This is a little bit inefficient in this sort of set as just a 4-mana spell to make 2 1/1 birds, but it does have the Populate mechanic, and if you're able to get a 3/3 with a bird attached to it or anything even larger than that, you have a real good deal. Not to mention it's a pretty good instant here too. Intangible Virtue, for some reason, coming up last here. Not a Populate spell, but the type of card that works very, very nicely with your tokens, making them a little bit larger, giving them vigilance, meaning that you play offense and defense, and really just swinging a race in your favor. Your opponent's not going to be able to catch up if you have a board of tokens when you play this. We also have Druid's Deliverance, which is Fog with Populate attached to it. More defensive card, but not one that you'd be super disappointed to play here. And then Sunder and Growth, mostly as a sideboard card. But again, if you're playing some sort of really heavy Naya deck, you have lots of large tokens, then I could see justifying Sunder and Growth in the main board. But keep in mind, there aren't a lot of effects that actually naturalize here, and you do have, you must have a target for Sunder and Growth before you can even cast it. Which also brings me to something else, that Populate doesn't actually target any creature that you control, so you can't really get blown out by it unless you only control one target. What I mean is, if say you have a 3/3 token and a 4/4 token, and you play a Populate spell, your opponent can't destroy your 4/4 in response and then fizzle the spell because you never targeted that token. What happens is they will destroy your 4/4, and you still get the option to Populate. You'll just have to take a smaller creature. But it's nice that your opponent destroying the creature that you intend to populate doesn't fizzle your spell completely. The key rares for this, one of them, Voice of Resurgence. This card justifies itself. It's very good against the instant speed decks in general, and keep in mind one of the big archetypes, the one we'll talk about next, is Esper, which focuses on blue-black control spells, mostly at instant speed. Voice of Resurgence really punishes your opponent for playing instants during your turn, and gives you a very sizable creature when it dies as well. Not to mention that creature's a token, and being able to copy it seems insane in this format. Populate spells were made for Voice of Resurgence. Advent of the Worm is also a card. Again, it used to be a mythic here and is downgraded to just a regular rare, but a very powerful one at that. An instant speed 5/5 for 4 mana would already be great, assuming you can pull off the colors on time. But being able to populate that is very strong. Advent of the Worm is the type of card that you first pick, and then you know you want to prioritize the populate spells. But keep in mind, other people probably don't want most of the populate spells, so you should prioritize having the big payoff cards like this before you go taking cards with populate on them. Broodmate Dragon does require a black splash, and you'll see this again in Jund, but the card is absolutely absurd, and being able to copy the 4/4 Dragon token is just as strong as the Urbis Protector, but even better since you have the Broodmate Dragon attached. 6 mana is very splashable in this format if you have any sort of mana fix and maybe a Signet or two, maybe a tap land or two, a Guildgate or something along those lines. But if you can pull off the black splash, you want Broodmate Dragon in any deck you can play it in, and it's exceptionally good in this populate deck. Entreat the Angels already has a pretty high threshold for being able to win the game, but populating angel tokens is pretty strong. Obviously, Entreat is just a powerful card on its own, but it does get a shout out for being a token generator in this particular format. Thragtusk is back again. We mentioned him in the Bant Shard, but I mean, he's just very good. Leaving behind a 3/3 that you can potentially copy is exactly what you want to be doing out of your 5 mana creature anyway, and Thragtusk is just solid by itself. Call of the Herd is similar to Thragtusk when it comes to this sort of deck, just a very efficient card as it is. Essentially, over the course of 2 turns, you end up with 3 elephants, and you have the perfect target for you to be able to populate. And finally, we have Blade Splicer on this list, which we saw again in the Bant video in the Blink deck. Obviously, any creature that comes down and has some sort of value attached to it is good in that particular deck, but they're also going to be good here if they make tokens, since they give you good targets to populate. Again, the Splicers in general are really good for this deck, since being able to make an army of golems with some sort of relevant keyword seems like a good way to be able to close out a game quickly. Making a bunch of 3/3 first strikers is really hard for your opponent to deal with, but you are going to be competing with the Bant decks for the Splicers in general, so keep that in mind. Blade Splicer, however, just like Thragtusk, is a perfectly strong first pickable card and sets you up to be nicely moved into either of these 2 archetypes if you see that they're really open, which is a nice thing to mention here as well. If you open up a rare like Blade Splicer or Thragtusk, you're very open with what you can do with it. There are 3 shards you can move into, and a lot that work in conjunction with your rares, so you could pick up a Blade Splicer early and then set yourself up for Bant or for Naya, depending on what's open. Whereas something like Advent of the Worm is much more narrow in which decks you can play it in and how strong it is in those decks. Still a fine card to first pick, but leaves your options a little bit less open than one of these monocolored rares here. Now, how do you beat this archetype? Well, you destroy all of its creatures. Granted, that's a good strategy against most archetypes, but there are a lot of sweepers at the high rarities here, and they deal with tokens very well. If your opponent can't keep a token on the battlefield, then their populate effects are useless. In fact, populate does absolutely nothing if you don't have a token on the battlefield already. Granted, most of the populate effects make tokens. That's probably not true. A lot of them do. But cards like Wake the Reflections, which just populate and don't really do anything else significant, don't have any extra meaning if you have no tokens on the battlefield. So sweep the board, take the creatures off the battlefield. In particular, just getting rid of tokens is much stronger than getting rid of creatures, since your opponent's not going to be able to replay those creatures. They're just gone permanently. But any of these board wipes will do, not to mention there are other board wipes that deal with 1/1 creatures and 2/2 creatures pretty nicely at common and uncommon. So if you find that your opponents are flooding the fields with creatures, make sure you have one of these available to you. Special shout out here to Sever the Bloodline, which can target a single token and take out all the other tokens with the same name. Yes, tokens do have names, and if your opponent's going really wide on their 3/3 beast tokens, Sever the Bloodline can take all of them out with one fell swoop and then flashback to do it again later. Sever the Bloodline seems like the big enemy of the token decks here, since it's a 2-for-1 a lot of times, and it also comes back and does it again in the late game. So that takes care of Naya for us. Next time I'll be talking about Esper, which is mostly the blue-black control deck here, with a little bit of white in there, a couple really weird cards for Esper, but super exciting stuff here. I hope you guys enjoyed this video on Naya, and I hope that when we get to Jund, you'll see the differences between the 2 kind of token decks that you can build here, and see why I left certain cards off this list. Jund is more focused on going wide, whereas Naya is focused on going big. So make some really big tokens, copy them, and then flood the board with your giant creatures, destroy your opponent with them. Seems like fun. I think this particular strategy is going to be really strong. But anyway, as always, I appreciate you guys watching. Any feedback you have would be great, and I hope this is helpful to you when you draft Modern Masters this coming up weekend. My name is Timothy, and as always, I will see y'all next time.